BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Knidheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Thursday, another Dahlia Thursday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Thursdays, I talk to you guys about the Black Dahlia murder, one of the most horrific crimes in American history. And this week on the program, I will be joined by Eli Frankel. He is the author of the book Sisters in Death, and he will be talking to us all about his Black Dahlia suspect, Carl Balsiger. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Black Dahlia murder. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Black Box Ned. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Eli Frankel to Black Box Online Radio. Eli, are you with me?
Sure am. Good to be here.
Firstly, can I say thank you so much for taking the time to appear on Black Box Online Radio's Dahlia Thursday, and congratulations on the success of your book, Sisters in Death. But I would actually like to start from the very beginning. And do you remember the time when you first learned about the Black Dahlia, the very first time?
Yeah, I actually do. It was 1999, and I was kind of fresh out of college and was taking any editor and assistant editor gigs I could in the television industry. And I was on probably a night shift at E Entertainment Television. And I was working on a television show back in the day called True Hollywood Stories and editing stories of old Hollywood celebrities and icons. And I was dubbing back then. You take VHS tapes and make copies of them by dubbing them in machines. And I was copying some tapes, and I looked over and I saw a discarded VHS tape that somebody had dubbed earlier in the day, and on it was a white label with a couple words written in ink on it. It just said Black Dahlia. And I just thought to myself, what is that? What is a Black Dahlia? Well, it turned out to be a Mysteries and Scandals episode that another editor was cutting and had left the VHS there. But I remember just being utterly kind of transfixed by the name. And I started, looking it up and trying to get some research. And I stole a copy. I guess I get in trouble with this, maybe 27 years later, less trouble. But I stole a copy of the VHS and watched it at home, and I just couldn't believe the story. It really grabbed me.
Yes, it is a very grabbing story, but you worked on the True Hollywood Stories?
Oh yeah, I've worked on a lot of different TV shows over the years and a lot of different documentaries. So I cut on True Hollywood Stories and Mysteries and Scandals at E and a few other shows.
Wow, we could do 3 hours just on that alone because I used to watch those all the time. And I mean, I think most of the audience will be familiar with the Black Dahlia story. Maybe they're an older generation, but the newer generation really has no idea what it's like when you're learning about the true crime world, as well as just the stories of the actors that you used to watch in the movies. Well, they would put stuff on the E network and you would watch it because that was your opportunity to learn. We didn't have YouTube. We didn't have videos that we could watch on the internet. We had the True Hollywood Stories, and that's how we learned about, even Elvis doing his movies, or even some of the Rat Pack individuals, and some of the more contemporary ones. I mean, I really don't mean to get sidetracked, but maybe we'll do something like that in the future, go through some old Hollywood stories.
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I learned some incredible things on that show, and looking back, I'm not sure I realized it at the time, but it really was a dream job. I've always been just absolutely fascinated by Hollywood and Hollywood history, and definitely the dark side of Hollywood. And so I got paid, not a lot, but I got paid at the time to edit together these great shows that sort of delved into all these different dark aspects of Hollywood. So, yeah, that would be a fun one to do.
Yes, that sounds good, though. But With your book, Sisters in Death, it has that title because you don't only talk about the Black Dahlia, you also talk about another story called The Prairie Heiress, and the murderer is named the Prairie Heiress Hunter. Would you like to provide an introduction for the listeners of Black Box Online Radio as to who was the Prairie Heiress and what's the backstory?
Yeah, well, I'd studied the Black Dahlia for many, many years. I was sort of a passive hobbyist, if you will. I would read every book, every article that came out. But I still was, sort of just reading everybody else's thoughts on it. And then eventually, when I got more serious about delving into the research and finding old documents that maybe weren't readily available to people, though they're available to the public, but really getting into the details, the weeds of the case. I started going through all of the suspects that the LAPD and the district attorney at that time were looking at, including some names that they hadn't been looking at that were intriguing that I'd come across in my research. And one of the names that really kind of stood out to me was the name of Carl Balsiger, who was the last man that Elizabeth Short was with in Los Angeles a month before her murder. And literally, she leaves him to go to San Diego, a city she had never been to and knew nobody in. And many people have speculated that she was either escaping from something or running away from something in Los Angeles, because she leaves at midnight on December 9th, 1946, and heads 3 hours south to 3 hours drive. Back then, she took a bus. It would have been 6 or 7 hours down to San Diego, and is there for a month, and then reappears in Los Angeles on January 9th, 1947. And that night, about 3 or 4 hours after she gets into town, she just disappears, and then her body is found 6 days later. And there was never any indication, any evidence of where she had been during that week. But as I researched the Black Dahlia and I took a look at all of the documents that had been released publicly, over and over again in the suspect list that continues on for the next 5 years after her murder until the case goes cold, the name that keeps appearing at the very top is this guy, Carl Balsiger, the guy she had been with for 3 days right before she escapes to San Diego. And nobody had done a real deep dive into who this guy was. What was his background? What was his story? And so in the few notes that are in the district attorney files about Carl Balsiger, about this really important suspect who, again, after all the names had been, or most of the names had been cleared or eliminated from the suspect list, he stays on there until the very end. What was it about this guy, I asked myself, that the police believed couldn't, there was enough evidence there that they could not clear him? There was clearly something about this guy, or something they knew, that had been of great concern to them. So in the notes that they wrote about Carl Balsiger, one of the things they said was that he had gone to college in Kansas City in the late 1930s with a woman named Leila Welsh, who had been killed in strikingly similar circumstances to the murder of Elizabeth Short. There were certain things done to the body of this woman, Leila Welsh, that they could not dismiss in terms of the parallels to the Short murder. So I thought that was pretty intriguing. And there was another intriguing element in that the LAPD tried to get the case files for the murder of Leila Welsh. This murder occurred, by the way, in 1941, 6 years before the murder of Elizabeth Short. They tried to get the files from the Kansas City Police Department, and the KCPD promised they would send them over, and they never did. And this occurred over a number of years. And so the LAPD was sort of hobbled in its investigation. They didn't have all the files, and they didn't know enough about Welsh's murder. And they didn't know if Carl Balsiger actually knew Leila Welsh when they were in college together at the University of Kansas City in the late 1930s. But they knew that he had gone to school with her, and here's this other woman who bore very striking marks on her body after her murder, to those left on the body of Elizabeth Short. And so they continued to pursue this, but eventually the case went cold and the LAPD moved on. So I figured, 70, 80 years later, maybe I might have a little more luck getting those files loosened up in Kansas City. And what I discovered was what I think is a body of evidence that is extremely compelling regarding the two murders and striking similarities between them well beyond what the Los Angeles Police Department investigators ever knew.
Okay, so Elizabeth Short was the Black Dahlia. Leila Welsh was the Prairie Heiress. But didn't Carl Balsiger have a relative that died under some very bizarre circumstances in a drowning incident?
That's correct. Yeah, his family. So Balsiger came from a fairly wealthy, very well connected family in Kansas City. His father, Herman Balsiger, was a grocer who then became a very important executive in interstate bakeries, which was in Kansas City. A lot of the world's largest bakeries began in Kansas City. And so Interstate, which later on would become Hostess Brands that we all know, his father was a pretty powerful executive in that firm. And they had bought a lake house outside of Kansas City, about 20, 25 minutes drive away, at a place called Lake of the Forest. It's a pretty modest place, but a nice little summer cottage, if you will, to get away from the kind of searing heat of Kansas City in the summer back then. Remember, air conditioning was not as ubiquitous as it is today. And so they bought this lake house in the 1920s. And when Carl Balsiger was 12 years old, his 7-year-old sister was Helen Elizabeth Balsiger, drowned in the lake there. She had been going to some swimming lessons at the clubhouse and then was biking back. It's only a little under a quarter of a mile from the clubhouse back to the Balsiger home on the lake. And somehow her bike careened into the lake and she drowned. And at the time, the police reports and the newspaper articles, you can tell, are kind of skeptical about the circumstances, but they claim that it's a tragic drowning. Well, I went to Lake of the Forest and I met with some folks there and we took a look at the circumstances. It appears to me that it's almost impossible for the 7-year-old girl to have drowned in that lake where she was. First of all, the road is the dirt path she was on was a few feet from where the lake was. It would have been very difficult for her bicycle to have careened in the lake. But in addition to that, the bike was found sitting upright out of the water. It was only about 7 or 8 inches deep there. And in fact, the lake itself at its deepest point, which is pretty far inside, is only about 10 to 12 feet deep. So this is a very, very shallow man-made lake. They found her body in the center of the lake, about 200 feet away. And they pulled it up about 2 hours after she went missing and declared her drowned. But there were no marks on her head. And the police report stated that she had fallen into the lake and hit her head and obviously drifted into the center of the lake. But there were no marks left on her head. There was no indication that she had had any kind of horrific accident on there. And there's no current in the lake. It doesn't move. Only in the springtime when there's water runoff does it actually move, and it moves in the opposite direction of where her body was found. So that, in addition to some other circumstances regarding the drowning, really seems suspicious to me. Now, it's possible that she did drown, but it seems like the circumstances made it impossible and certainly lead to some questions about whether Carl may have been involved in his own sister's death.
Well, if she didn't drown, then what would be the alternatives? Because, I mean, it seemed like if it were something that were much more obvious, why wouldn't they just report that? What do you think happened if, in this hypothetical scenario, Carl Balsiger was responsible for his sister's death and it was not a drowning? What do you think happened?
Well, it's very possible that he would have gone in the lake with her, pulled her in the lake, or was playing in the lake with her, and then held her head under the water and drowned her. I think that is very possible. Now, I don't know that for sure. There may be other circumstances that were not reported, but again, having been to the location, having talked to people who've lived there for decades, it certainly seems to be a very suspicious drowning. In addition, Herman Balsiger, their father, was the chairman of the board of directors of Lake of the Forest. And so when the local police showed up, he ensured that Kansas City police arrived to have the body transported quickly back to the city. They were never able to conduct an autopsy in the small town in which this occurred, and she was buried quickly thereafter. So it seems as if the family, at the very least, did not want an investigation at in the jurisdiction of I think it was Edwardsville or whatever it is, the small town that's there. That can never happen today. You couldn't just decide to have the daughter's body sent back to Kansas City and then quickly buried there. But it seems as if the family did not want there to be a thorough investigation into the circumstances of the drowning.
Right. So it sounds like it was a drowning, but you're claiming that it was not an accidental drowning, that it was a murder. It's just he if hypothetically she were murdered, he would have held her underwater and forced the drowning. Did I get you right?
Correct.
Okay, then. So would you like to talk to us about some of the similarities between the murders of Leila Welsh and Elizabeth Short? And this is Dahlia Thursday here on Black Box Online Radio. And I would like to remind everybody that I'm talking to Eli Frankel, author of the book Sisters in Death. And if you want to follow along with these regular discussions, you can always hit the like button and subscribe. But because this is a regular segment, I expect that the audience does know a certain amount of the details about what was done to Elizabeth Short. So, if you were to just get right to the middle of the action, what are the similarities between the murders of Leila Welsh and the murder of Elizabeth Short?
Yeah, so just to put a little context here, Leila Welsh lived in a fairly modest neighborhood in what were then the suburbs of Kansas City, probably a 10-minute drive from downtown. And she was the heiress to a real estate fortune in Kansas City. Her family had been really important in the early sort of building of the city out of the frontier into this huge metropolis in the Midwest that it eventually became. And they were wealthy, and she was going to inherit a lot of money, but she and her mother and her brother actually lived very modestly. She had grown up on a farm, and her mother wanted to purposely maintain a sort of simple lifestyle for her. So the three of them lived in a very small home, only about 1,400 square feet in Kansas City on Rock Hill Road. And one night, she came home early in the morning after a date with her boyfriend, Richard Funk. She walks into the home around 1:45 a.m. And says goodnight to her mother, and then walks down the hall, very short, small hall. Again, it's a very tight home, and goes into her bedroom. She changes, and then she goes to sleep around 2 a.m., 2:10 a.m. Sometime around 3 a.m., her mother is awoken by the sounds of two thuds, two deep thuds. She wakes up, she walks in the living room, and she sees that her son is asleep on the couch in the living room. Oftentimes he fell asleep early. He was actually a narcoleptic and had fallen asleep there. And so she turned the light off, goes back to sleep. And what she doesn't know is at that moment in her daughter's bedroom is a man who is disassembling her daughter into pieces. And this is a guy who was waiting outside of the bedroom for hours in 31, 32-degree weather, had been watching through the window in the backyard. And this is a backyard in a very tight space there. It's surrounded by other homes. The police actually counted, I believe it was 36 or 38 windows from surrounding homes looked out into the backyard of the Welsh home where the killer was waiting for her. And with him was a kit bag of torture and murder implements that he had brought with him. Leila Welsh, when she came home, left the window open. She opened it because she wanted the cold air. There was a boiler in the house that back then, you'd turn on the boiler and there'd be a lot of heat and you really couldn't control the heat as much. So it got hot and she opened the window for cold air. She had also grown up on a farm. And so she stuck to her principles that, she's not going to change open doors or unlock doors or open windows. And that's the way she's going to live her life. So she opens the window and unwittingly gave passage to this killer who, once she was asleep at 3 a.m., snuck in and then hit her twice over her right temple with a 4.5 pound, what's called a railroad hammer, a track hammer. It's used to drive in spikes in railroads. This is a much bigger tool than one would need. It's nearly 5 pounds. He hits her twice over the head. And then her mother awakens. He places a chair with a broken back against the door, kind of haphazardly under the doorknob, just to keep out anybody who might try to come in while he's going to do his work for the next hour, hour and a half. And what he does is he first attempts to essentially bisect her by cutting into her neck and trying to sever her at the vertebrae. There was a large V-shaped cut, gaping wound in her neck. Her head was almost taken off of her body, and they found notch marks on the vertebrae bones there, indicating that the killer was struggling to remove the head from the rest of the body. He then bled her out. There was an enormous amount of blood coming out of the wound from her head, and he had cut the neck in order to bleed her out, to exsanguinate her. He waits in the room for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes, while the body is draining out of blood, just pouring out. And in fact, there was so much blood, it went between the floorboards and eventually deposited into the basement, into a bin in the basement where the police found this enormous pool of blood the next day. He then cuts a 1 pound, 1 inch thick, about 4.5 pound circumference piece of flesh from out of her thigh. Now, again, this is 1 inch thick, so we're talking about skin, subcutaneous tissue, muscle, and fat. And the thing that's really important here is that the shape of the piece of flesh that he cuts out of her thigh is a bell or horseshoe-shaped piece of flesh. The police describe it as being in one smooth motion, almost like there were no kind of jagged cuts or tears, just one smooth motion, indicating somebody who had experience with a knife and was likely performed with a razor blade, not with a butcher knife. The butcher knife he brought was used to cut her neck open. And so he cuts out this piece of flesh. And what's important here, these details, is that there is no blood inside the cavity of the flesh wound where the flesh was taken out. It's completely bloodless. There's no dirt, there's no grime, there's nothing. It's just this open, like, puzzle piece, this gaping horseshoe-shaped piece of flesh that is missing from the thigh, about 1 inch thick. And then there were other mutilations that he made. He had brought with him a 2-tine carving fork that he left, the mark of which he left in her body. And there were other marks that he left, mysterious marks that were left in blood on there. But the murder also evidenced somebody who had a great blood avoidance tendency. The killer did not step in the massive pool of blood that was on the floor. He was very cautious to step on the rug that was next to her bed. He brought gloves and wore them the entire time. He had a rag with him, which he used to stop the river of blood that was coming out of her neck when he was exsanguinating her. And there's significant other similarities that are detailed in the book that connect to the murder of Elizabeth Short. But the most important one here is that carved out of the Black Dahlia, carved out of Elizabeth Short, the killer, after he had exsanguinated her, and after he had bisected the body cleanly in 2 pieces, the killer of Elizabeth Short carved a 1 pound, 1 inch thick horseshoe or bell-shaped piece of flesh with muscle, skin, muscle, subcutaneous fat, and tissue out of her thigh and then left it inside her body. And so we see literally the exact same piece of flesh, same size, same thickness, same shape, having been carved out of Elizabeth Short, just like with Leela Welsh. And there were certain marks. There was a tic-tac-toe mark that he left on the piece of flesh that he took out of Elizabeth Short. And the matching, this is kind of crazy, but the matching symbol was found on her thigh in the exact place where Leela Welsh's flesh was taken out of her thigh. And in addition, the police, the LAPD investigators, stated that the piece of flesh that was taken out of Elizabeth Short's thigh was cut, once again, in one smooth motion, no jagged marks, no stops or starts, and was used, a razor blade was used. Now, with the rest of the Elizabeth Short murder, they believe a butcher knife was used. So again, we see the same two implements, a butcher knife and a razor blade, being used in the torture and murder of both women.
And I do. I mean, I'll give you that. Like, I think that that is the biggest similarity, the horseshoe cut to the leg of both Leela Welsh and Elizabeth Short. But based on everything you said, it doesn't sound like the horseshoe cut to the leg was used to drain the blood from the body. You said very clearly that Leela Welsh was more or less bleeding out from the neck wound, and Elizabeth Short was, of course, bisected, cut in half. You must have put some thought into this about what the killer was doing. I know we don't have to be psychics, or we don't have to act like we were a fly on the wall when this happened, or read anybody's mind, especially from beyond the grave. But why do you think the killer did that? And you even said in your presentation right now that that was not done so much where it's leaving behind blood that's coming out of the wound of Leela Welsh. Why do you think the killer cut out these horseshoe pieces of flesh from the victims?
Well, I think that that's what his intent was in both murders. I think that we have to understand the motive here, which is something that bedeviled both police departments, the LAPD and the KCPD. Why do this? Why go to the trouble? It's an extremely vulnerable, dangerous position the killer has put himself in. And yet, here you have somebody who's willing to take the risk to do it. What is the point of doing this? And they never could really figure that out. And I think the answer is rather simple and horrifying. I think this was somebody who fantasized for many, many years about having total control and power over beautiful women that he wanted and could never be with, and that ultimately his goal, his fantasy, was to penetrate flesh, to cut a 1 inch thick piece of flesh out of the bodies of his victims. I think the ultimate satisfaction for him, the purpose that he was put on this earth, was to do that. And he was intent on penetrating flesh with a knife, with a razor blade. There's similarities we see in that with lust murders, and there's piquerism, which is the kind of sexual pleasure of carving into people's flesh. And I think this is what we're dealing with here, is a killer who is ultimately turned on and is fascinated and attracted in ways that are almost like a drug addict is attracted to drugs, wants to cut the flesh, the fatty flesh of beautiful women. It's that simple. And so when the opportunity arises to do that, like a hunter, a stalker, he waits for his prey, and when the moment arises, he does it. Now, in both murders, you also see somebody like a hunter who has the skills to wait. They're patient, but and they're also methodical. These murders are not like Jack the Ripper. They're not sort of wild, abandoned, and done out of rage and passion. He's not obliterating them. He's slow and meticulous. He's taking his time, and he takes the time to exsanguinate both victims. He cuts them in half, or attempts to, in Leela Welsh's case, and waits for the body to bleed out, because ultimately, when he carves the flesh out, he wants there to be no blood in the cavity. He avoids blood. He doesn't like the look or the smell or the feel of blood. And so the exsanguination is in order to be able to allow him to do his work without having blood getting in the way.
All right, though, but if we're going to talk about your suspect, Carl Balsiger, you said that he was the last person to spend time with Elizabeth Short before she went to San Diego. But is there something in his file about how he lied about the last time that he saw Elizabeth Short and he was caught in a lie by the authorities?
Yeah, that's correct. And that's definitely one of the reasons I think the police were alerted to him was that as soon as they located him, his name had come up as having known her. And so when they finally located him, they questioned him. And immediately the investigators identified lies in his story. For example, he said that he had taken her to Camarillo, California, which is a small farming town outside of Los Angeles, maybe an hour and 15 minutes drive away. Back then, it probably would have taken 2 hours. And so he had taken her there to sell bakery supplies. He was a salesman of bakery supplies and also margarine and butter and milk. And he had taken there to make some of his runs, and then he returned and dropped her off at a motel on Yucca Street in Hollywood, which is pretty close to Hollywood Boulevard. Well, the police went to Yucca. They went to every motel in Hollywood, and there was no record of Elizabeth Short, and there certainly wasn't a record of him. In addition, he stated that he was only with her for a day and a half, but the police knew from the timeline they'd gathered that there was a 3 day missing kind of hole in her schedule. One of the things the police did was they tried to figure out exactly where she'd been the last couple months, 3, 4 months of her life in Los Angeles, and they put together this timeline. Well, there was this gaping 3 day hole leading up to her midnight escape to San Diego on December 9th, 1946, a month before her murder. And eventually they figure out that Carl Balsiger was with her. Well, he told the police he was only with her for a day and a half. They knew that wasn't true because there was 3 days missing there. Eventually, when they interrogated him about 3 or 4 years later in St. Louis, he admitted that he had lied and he was with her for the full 3 days. But as it turns out, in my research, what I discovered was that there were so many other lies he told the police that they never knew about. He lied about where he lived. They believed that he lived in a rooming house in Hollywood, and when in fact, he lived in an isolated home in remote Benedict Canyon, about 3 minutes drive north of some of the largest mansions of Beverly Hills. The area he lived in was not built up yet at that time, and so it was a very remote location. He also lied to them about when he met Elizabeth Short. He claimed he met her on the morning of December 6th, 1946, at a real estate office, and that's where he picked her up, and she decided to tag along and go to Camarillo. Well, it turns out he actually knew her well before that, and a lot of other lies that he told. It's very clear that Balsiger was trying to hide something from the police. His story is riddled with inaccuracies.
All right, though. So I would actually like you to kind of give your input on something because I don't know about you, but one thing that I found to be very frustrating is to find out what Elizabeth Short was actually doing with all of these men that she crossed paths with in her life. Do you think there was any type of romantic relationship going on with Carl Balsiger, or do you think Elizabeth Short was doing what other people have speculated on, and that is that she was just spending time with people, getting free rides, getting free rooms, getting free dinners, and that she was actually somewhat opposed even to physical intimacy? I mean, sometimes you'll hear that, oh, this person was her ex-boyfriend, but then you find out that once you get down to the fine details, there doesn't seem to be any real description of any intimacy taking place. What do you think was going on with Elizabeth Short and Carl Balsiger? And feel free to be as speculative as you want.
Yeah, I actually think that there was no sexual or romantic relationship between them. Balsiger was, he seems to have been uh, sexually inactive or sexually incapable. I spoke with relatives of the two women he later married in the 1950s, and both families told me that the rumor was from the ex-wives that he wouldn't have sex with them. There was some kind of dysfunction there. He wasn't gay, but there was some kind of dysfunction there sexually. And Elizabeth Short also had some sexual dysfunctions. She had an inflamed Bartholin gland, which is the gland in the vagina that lubricates it during sex. It was inflamed and infected, and so she had to get it lanced quite often. Back then, obviously, medicine wasn't where it is today, and so sex was very painful for her. It was uncomfortable. The police were able to determine that over the course of her life, as best they could determine, that she only had sex with three men in her past. And there were a lot of men who testified that she was kind of, they called her a cold fish, if you will. She just wasn't somebody who enjoyed intimacy or sex at all. And as you pointed out, a lot of her dating seemed to have been somewhat transactional. She got a free dinner out of it, or went out with a guy and they went dancing. But I think in a lot of ways that's also been used to malign her. I think that she went out and had fun. And it's Hollywood, it's post-war Hollywood. People went out for $1.50 dinner back then. They went dancing all the time. She wasn't obligated to engage in sexual acts with the guy who took her out for dinner. And, I think she had fun and she went on dates. She got asked out a lot. And I think that's really the sort of the end of it. This idea that somehow she was a chiseler who was constantly chiseling for dates or money or whatever. Yeah, she asked people for favors, but this was also a woman who had worked since she was 16 years old. She was an incredibly responsible person at certain, points of her life. And in Los Angeles, she didn't work because she knew she was only going to be there for a few months and she was seeing the city. So I think there may have been things in Elizabeth Short and her someone, sexual dysfunction or antipathy towards sexual intimacy that Balsiger may have seen and identified with and hated about him, hated that aspect of himself and therefore hated it in Elizabeth Short as well.
So it sounds like Carl Balsiger is just impotent, and for some unknown reason, I mean, there are numerous medical reasons that could cause impotency, and Elizabeth Short has dysfunction, as you said. But I guess I would still just kind of like a little bit of clarity, meaning like, what do you think they were doing together? Just like spending time, just being casual acquaintances, and
Yeah.
just driving around. As you said, he's taking her on some work related drives and she's just kind of in the passenger seat and I guess just time and company.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really important and I think overlooked part of the Elizabeth Short story, which is that in um, in late November, she got thrown out of Mark Hanson's house. For anybody who doesn't know, this is a pretty famous part of the story. Mark Hanson it was kind of owned and operated a couple theaters and a very big nightclub in Hollywood, and she ended up living in his home for a while. And then eventually she gets kicked out in late November of 1946, and she goes to live at a in a room at the Chancellor Hotel with seven other women. They're all crammed into one house, into one room. And she was not a big fan of her new roommates. I think she kind of looked down on them and found them to be kind of, you know, just sort of, how would I put it? Sort of crass, crude people who were sort of beneath her. She was from Massachusetts and considered herself sort of a little bit more classy. And the roommates weren't too crazy about her either. She hated living there. She was there for 3 weeks. And towards the end of her stay there, she decided that she was done with Los Angeles. She didn't like it anymore. She didn't like the people, and she was going to head back probably to Chicago. But two of her roommates were actually caught with marijuana joints, right? They called them marijuana sticks back then. The police, somebody informed on them. I don't think it was Elizabeth Short, but somebody informed on them. The police showed up and arrested them and confiscated these sticks of marijuana. And Elizabeth Short got super paranoid because she was their roommate and she became very worried that the police were going to come after her. And she had some reason for that. When she was in Los Angeles the last time in 1943 during the war, she was staying in Santa Barbara, and she got arrested one night with two other men, with two servicemen and a friend of hers, a girlfriend she was living with. And it turns out they had been drinking, and she was underage, and so she ends up getting sent back to Massachusetts from California. And I think she was really worried that her record, had this arrest for underage drinking and that she would get in trouble because her roommates were smoking marijuana. And she told her best friends that she had to get out of Los Angeles because she didn't know what was going to happen with this marijuana case. So this is all happening in early December of 1946, and she keeps telling people over and over again she's leaving town soon. She's going to Berkeley to visit her sister, which was a lie, but likely she was planning on leaving Los Angeles. She was really sick of the town. She'd had some bad experiences there, and then this marijuana arrest. So on December 6th, she said, Carl Balsiger claimed that she met him at a real estate office, even though she would have had no reason for being in a real estate office. She wasn't looking to stay or rent or buy a home or an apartment. So, yeah, he picks her up and he takes her to Camarillo. And I think that she didn't know what she was going to do. I think she just wanted to get out of LA and needed some time to figure out what her next location was going to be. And when they went to Camarillo, it wasn't to go sell bakery supplies, as the police had been led to believe. Literally a few days earlier, Balsiger had opened up a bakery in Camarillo with a partner of his who lived in Ventura County up north. And they had opened up this bakery, which became a pretty big local success for a couple months until it all went south right after the murder of Elizabeth Short, and the police interrogating Balsiger and also questioning his business partner. That business relationship fell apart, and the book goes into some detail about why that occurred.
All right, though. So we have Carl Balsiger lying. We have Elizabeth Short trying to get away from a lot of things, actually. But you don't have to give everything away from the book. Well, everything that you've said so far really sounds like he is somebody who may have taken an interest in her because of they both have these types of biological dysfunctions. Well, then what is the motive? Why was she afraid of him? And what would drive somebody like Carl Balsiger to commit this heinous murder? And I know we've talked a little bit about the Prairie Heiress, but I would like your response to that question.
Well, we know that there were at least two times before her murder that Elizabeth Short got money from Carl Balsiger. She borrowed money from him. She borrowed money to pay her last week's rent. She got money from him, the $5 of the last week's rent. The landlord had held on to her suitcases and her all important makeup bag that was always with her unless she paid that last week's rent. So she goes out the morning of December 6th, gets the $5 from Carl Balsiger, rushes back to the building, to the Chancellor Hotel, pays the previous week's rent, gets her suitcases and makeup bag, and then jumps in Carl Balsiger's car and they drive up to Camarillo. So they were there for 3 days. And then suddenly she's on a bus at midnight on December 9th down to San Diego with no home. She shows up in San Diego with, a 50 cents in her pocket, and after she buys the bus ticket with money she got from him, and goes to sleep in a movie theater. So she's essentially homeless, and somebody takes her in. She stays with the family for a month. But I think that this was a woman who had borrowed money from him, who had been with him, probably made some promises, and then disappeared, not once, but actually twice before. And so there's a really important clue in the testimony of Red Manley, who was the guy she had been hanging out with in San Diego towards the end of her sojourn there. In early January 1947, she tells him she needs a ride back to LA. And there's a lot of mysteries that have kind of developed over the years about why she was leaving San Diego and returning to Los Angeles, and who is she going to stay with in Los Angeles. But there's a really important detail in Red Manley's testimony. And what he says is the day before they left, for San Diego for Los Angeles from San Diego. He was with her, and she asked him to take her up to Los Angeles that day, which was January 8th. And he told her he couldn't drive up that day, but that there was a bus that left every night for Los Angeles, and she could take that. And she said, "Great, drop me off at the bus station." Before they go to the bus station on January 8th, they go out to dinner at a diner. They go grab something to eat. And while they're sitting at the table, Elizabeth Short gets up and goes outside to the payphone and makes a call back to Los Angeles. Police were able to determine that a call was made to Los Angeles from that payphone. Who it was to, we don't know. But she returns to the table and tells Manley that she actually changed plans. She wants to return the next day. So she stays with him that night into January 9th at a motel in San Diego, and then they return the next day, the fateful January 9th, the night of which she will disappear from the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. It's very obvious that she made a call to somebody in LA, and that changed her plans about the day she would return. And that's really important. It's been speculated for a long time this could have been a stranger who picked her up on the night of January 9th. It may be somebody that she never knew. But we do know now that her plans completely changed on the evening of January 8th, and then therefore she planned to meet somebody the next day. She likely knew her killer. I believe the reason that she was returning to Los Angeles was not to go stay with somebody or to stay in town. She had told an ex-boyfriend in letters that she was now leaving Southern California. She was not going to return, and she was headed back to Chicago, a city that she really loved and had a great time in the previous summer. So the reason she's going back to Los Angeles from San Diego is because the bus for Chicago leaves from the Greyhound station on 6th Street in downtown Los Angeles. You can't take a bus from San Diego. And so she's headed back to the bus station. The problem is it's $36.85, which is a lot of money back then. It's probably about $540 to get a ticket for the 3-day bus ride back from Los Angeles to Chicago. And she doesn't have a dime to her name. Red Manley and the French family who she had lived with in San Diego stated that she actually asked the mother, Elvira French, for $1. She'd had not a dime to her name. And so with just $1 on her, she wouldn't have had the money for a ticket. And she asked Red Manley, and he didn't have any money. So he drops her off at the Biltmore Hotel. The reason that I believe she waited at the Biltmore Hotel was because she needed to get that money. That's the way she lived her life. Show up at the bus station, show up at the hotel, and figure out once you're there how you're going to get the money for that bus ticket. And the guy that she went to for that was the guy she had borrowed money from before, which was Carl Balsiger.
But to be very clear, that it sounds like that is a hypothesis that you're putting forward. But
Correct.
there has not been an established meeting between Elizabeth Short and Carl Bolsiger at that time, correct?
That's correct. We don't know who it was that she eventually met there. We do know at approximately 10 p.m., according to the testimony of the doorman who was on the in the inside of the Biltmore Hotel in the rendezvous court, the big lobby there, the night she disappeared, that she had been waiting in the lobby there for a long time. There were certain people who thought that they may have seen her walking over to the payphones or at a payphone, but that was never conclusively established. But at around 10 p.m., he sees her look up as if she recognized somebody on the outside through the large windows in that lobby, and then stood up and walked out of the lobby and then turned south on Olive Street as he opened the large brass doors to let her out. So it appears, unless he was mistaken, that somebody had kind of alighted that she had been waiting for outside, and she went to meet him.
Now, I have two questions for you that I'm going to put together. The first is it true that Elizabeth Short had belongings with her and she put them in a storage unit at the bus terminal, which doesn't sound like, a conventional storage unit. It sounds like where people would keep their luggage while they're waiting. And the second question is the more important question. And that is, what do you think happened after January 9th and before January 15th? Two questions in one.
Yeah. So you bring up a great point, and it's really important. When Elizabeth Short returned to Los Angeles with Red Manley, approximately 6:30 p.m. on January 9th, 1947, the place she asked him to take her to is the Greyhound bus station. They go inside, and she immediately puts her bags and her makeup bag, which she always had with her. She was never away from her makeup bag. She was somebody who was impeccable and clean and always made up and very presentable. Her appearance was really important to her. And so no matter where she was, her makeup bag was always with her. She puts these all important personal effects into a locker there. And then his testimony has some contradictions in it, but either she requests or he tells her she should not stay in the bus station. She lies to him and tells him that she needs to go eventually to the Biltmore Hotel where she's going to meet her sister. But I believe that was just a cover story to get him essentially to leave. Like, now that you've driven me back, thanks for the ride back to Los Angeles, I don't need you anymore. She had other reasons there. Manley didn't have the money that she needed for that bus ticket back to Chicago. And he gives her a ride back to the Biltmore Hotel, which is about 8 blocks away, where she's apparently going to meet her sister. The reason I believe that she put her bags into storage at the Greyhound bus station, even though she was apparently going to meet and stay with her sister at the Biltmore Hotel, is that she intended to leave on either the 10:50 or 11 a.m. buses that would have taken her to Chicago. There were two buses that left later that night, each with different routes. And so she had basically 3.5 hours to somehow get the money she needed to buy a ticket. There is no way, if Elizabeth Short had been staying in Los Angeles or intended to stay in Los Angeles or intended to spend the night in anybody's place, that she would have not had her luggage and her makeup bag. She had never been away from that makeup bag. And so she put those items in storage at Greyhound because she intended to return to Greyhound bus station later that night. Why did she go to the Biltmore Hotel? She was going there to meet somebody for maybe an hour, hour and a half, go get a drink, go get something to eat, and then drop the bomb. I need $40 for my trip, which is, again, a lot of money back then. But her plan, her intent was to get the money and then return to Greyhound and take off that night for Chicago.
All right,
And
though,
then,
but oh, I guess I'll let you finish. Go ahead.
no. I was going to say move on to the second part, but what was your question?
Well, it's not so much a question, it's more like a comment. It's about how I think that everything you said is completely spot on because the way that I've always interpreted that is that Elizabeth Short was confident that she could get the ticket. She was confident that she could pay the bus fare. I mean, to leave your stuff at the storage unit, the locker at the bus station, that means that she thought she could get the money. But the question though, I guess, would be the function of the Biltmore Hotel, right, is not only a meeting point. You can meet people at many places, but it was a convenient place to use the telephone, correct? And is that why she went there?
No, I don't think it was to use the telephone. I mean, there would have been payphones available myriad payphones at the bus station, and there were payphones everywhere back then. I mean, people that obviously didn't have cell phones back then. I think the reason she was at the Biltmore was that it was a fancy and proper place to potentially meet a date. Ultimately, her goal is to pry $40 out of her date. But she's got to be charming. She's got to spend some time with this person. And so if you're going to meet somebody for a date, you don't do it at the somewhat seedy bus station on 6 near Skid Row, where all the Greyhound buses took off late at night. It would have, and also it kind of would have blown her cover that she's leaving town. I think she wanted to meet at a location that was appropriate to spend some quality time together with a potential date, and then to get the money she needed and quickly return to the seedy bus station, get that ticket, get her stuff out of storage, and get the hell out of Los Angeles.
All right, fair enough, though. But now let's move on to the second part of the question, and that is, what do you think was going on between January 9th and January 15th?
I think no matter what anybody believes in terms of theories, suspects, put everything away, put Carl Balsiger aside. I think that she got into a car with somebody who promised to drive her back to the bus station and give her the money she needed, or give her a ride wherever she wanted to go. And then once she was in the car, that person attacked her and hit her twice over the head in the right temple, forming two depressions in her skull, just like Leela Welsh was hit. Two hits to the right temple, depressions that did not crack the skull, but broke it essentially, and that she was incapacitated. And then the killer drove her back to his home, and she was tied up with either wire or rope in a basement, some kind of remote room, likely a garage. There aren't a ton of homes with basements in Southern California. And that she was held captive for 5.5 days. I think she was slowly tortured over that time. Not all the torture marks that we see on the body, but there were all these little cuts with razor blades about her face, especially in the upper lip. And I mean, myriad little cuts. And I think that those were done to torture her over a number of days. She was also fed. We know that her stomach was full. She had eaten the night before. And I think she was held captive. I think this was a killer who had ultimate power and authority over this young woman and enjoyed it. I also think that he probably wasn't sure what he was going to do and waited quite a while before he actually began the full torture, which is horrific. And from the autopsy report, we can pretty much glean what was done to her. And suffice it to say that it is the worst of the worst. It's kind of beyond description. And then once she was dead, likely she had choked on the blood that had come out of her mouth when he cut open her mouth from the corners of her, cut open her face from the corners of her mouth towards her ears. The blood that poured out of there likely choked her. She drowned in her own blood. And then he continued to perform mutilations on her. He severed her body cleanly in two. He cut the flesh from her thigh and left marks with a knife on her body. And then sometime around 1:30 a.m. on the morning of January 15th, 1947, he begins washing and scrubbing the body, which is another really important indicator of this guy's signature, his MO. And then around 6:30 a.m. deposits the two cleanly severed body parts in the weed-strewn lots on Norton Avenue in Lemare Park.
All right, though. So, Eli Frankel, I would actually like to give you a choice because you're the guest. Would you like a question that is important or not important?
Oh, interesting. Wow. You know what? Let's go with non-important, because that actually sounds like it could. That's a little bit more of a grab bag there.
Okay, I'm going to give you both of them, but we're going to do the not important question first.
Okay.
Now, I started this segment, Dahlia Thursday, and I didn't know what was going to happen with the Black Dahlia case. This is the newest case for me that I talk about here on Black Box Online Radio, and the show comes to everybody Monday through Friday talking about unsolved mysteries. On Thursdays, I talk about the Black Dahlia. Then, what happened was, firstly, Eli Frankel put out his book, Sisters in Death, and then in December of 2025, there was a media firestorm where somebody named Alex Baber was proposing a different Black Dahlia suspect named Marvin Margolis and talking about a Zodiac killer connection. Then in January, or January or February, was it? We have the William J. Mann book coming out, also talking about Marvin Margolis as a Black Dahlia suspect. Because you follow this case so closely, You must have seen the news. You must have seen things about Marvin Margolis. You probably encountered him in your research because he was a real Black Dahlia suspect. But what do you think about Marvin Margolis? Do you have any comments about him at all, even if there are reasons why you disagree with him as a suspect? Because, of course, you have your own Carl Balsiger. What do you think?
Oh, I've never heard of him before. No, I'm kidding. Yes, I'm very familiar with Marvin Margolis. I researched him intensely during my research phase. I know
Of
Alex
course.
Baber. I like Alex a lot. I think his theory does not hold up. So Marvin Margolis was a World War II vet, and he lived with a guy named Bill Robinson in a building, the Guardian Arms, in on the seventh floor in Hollywood. And Elizabeth Short stayed with him and Bill for 10 days in October after the first time she got kicked out of Mark Hansen's house. And then, yeah, she was with them for 10 days and then, leaves to return back to Mark Hansen's home. The thing about Margolis, and I actually spoke with his family, and I don't believe the guy killed anybody. He was an artist. He was a larger than life personality. He had been through some difficult circumstances in the war, but there's a really important detail in his life. He had gotten married in November of 1946 to Edith Bernstein from Chicago, who he'd been dating before. She came out to Los Angeles and they were living together in January of 1947. And Edith wasn't a dark person. She didn't have significant issues and would not have tolerated her husband holding a woman captive in their home for 6 days. They were newlyweds. They were happy. He was also going to classes at USC in early to mid-January of 1947. And then also, when you look at the totality of Margolis's life, there's no violence there. Certainly not like Balsiger, who was a very violent individual and attacked dates and was a stalker. There were numerous stalker incidents across his life. There's no behavioral evidence of somebody who is the ultimate psychopath and sort of brutal murderer the way you would see with somebody who would have committed the murder of Elizabeth Short. And he was an artist. He was sort of a free spirit. The other thing too that's really important is if you've studied the Zodiac, you know that there is absolutely no connection with the Black Dahlia murder. They're completely different eras. They're different geographic locations. And it's 98% certain that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac killer. The MOs are completely different. The way the murders were committed, the Black Dahlia murder was a phantom. He worked in the night. He stole a woman and then committed that murder with nobody around in a remote location, deposited the body, and this is in the book as well, not the way people think in full view on Norton Avenue, but rather hid her body so that it wouldn't be found. Whereas the Zodiac I mean, there's so many, things to go into, but it's a completely different set of murders. And there's a lot of other evidence too. I think there's been a lot of stuff that's been misrepresented in Baber's account. And there's a few articles online that I think go into some pretty good detail about what those inconsistencies are. It got a lot of attention because it's a splashy story, but upon any closer examination, it becomes very clear that I think to me and any serious academic in the area that there is absolutely no connection between these series of murders.
Okay, and it sounds like Arthur Lee Allen is your Zodiac killer suspect, correct?
Look, the Zodiac is a huge case, and there's been numerous names that have come up, but yeah, I've studied it pretty extensively, and to me, there is little doubt that Arthur Lee Allen was the killer.
All right, well, perhaps we will do a Zodiac killer episode in the future. Very
Yeah.
nice. But I told that the important question was still there, and you already alluded to it because I think if people were to look into your book, Sisters in Death, they would find three things very early on. Number one, you're proposing that there's a Black Dahlia connection to the Prairie Heiress. The murders of Leela Welsh and Elizabeth Short were committed by the same person. Number two, that Carl Balsiger is the suspect. We've gone over all that. And number three, is that the body of Elizabeth Short was moved before it was photographed. And as you already gave us somewhat of a primer for that, but you don't have to give away everything from your book. However, would you like to give us more information about why you think the body of Elizabeth Short was moved before she was photographed?
Yeah. So every account of the Black Dahlia, I mean, every account starts the same way. It's the morning of January 15th, 1947, and 26-year-old housewife Betty Bersinger is walking down Norton Avenue in Lemare Park in South Central Los Angeles. She's on her way to get her husband's shoes fixed, and she's pushing a stroller with her 3-year-old daughter, Anne, in tow. And as she's going down a 2-block stretch of empty weed-strewn lots that hadn't been built up, now for miles around it, you know, sprawl, suburban construction, there's tons of stuff going on. The city is, it's all city there in concrete. But for this 2-block stretch, it hasn't been built up because housing construction stopped during the war. So she's walking down this stretch of weed-strewn lots. There's trash thrown in the weeds, and she looks to her right, and there is the 2 body parts of Elizabeth Short left out in full display, separated by about 12 to 14 inches. It's clearly been laid out to shock the world, right? It's like 2 or 3 inches from the sidewalk, just this body, this map of torture and horror staring up at her. And she runs down the street screaming and finds the first house and goes inside and calls the police. Somebody's been murdered. There's another account of the story in which she thinks that it's just a mannequin and calls the police and tells them, you should take this away before kids see it. It could scare them. But nonetheless, she sees the form right there on the sidewalk. The killer has left his handiwork to shock and terrify the city, to put his mark upon Los Angeles. The thing that always kind of bugged me about that never quite made sense, is that she found the body at 10:50 a.m., which is, we're getting into late morning at that point. The stretch of Norton Avenue where the body was left is a heavily trafficked street. From sunup, there's people up and down that street. There's actually a streetcar that deposits hundreds of commuters like a block and a half away. And so people are walking from homes into downtown Lemare Park right along that stretch of road. How is it possible that nobody saw that body until 10:50 a.m.? It didn't make any sense. I mean, it's on full display. If you look at the photographs, which are, readily available online, you can't miss this heavily tortured corpse that has been left in full display by the sidewalk. So I realized that, look, there's no way I'm going to be able to pry this out of the LAPD or get the files that have been locked away forever in vaults and have never been released on the murder case. But I suspected that it had something to do with what the police had referred to as the key question, which was a fact about the way the body was left that they had never publicly revealed. The newspaper reporters didn't know about it. The other detectives in the department didn't know about it. It was a heavily kind of fortified secret. The secret clue, they also called it, that had been held back from the public. And the reason they did that is because they wanted to be able to distinguish the real killer from false confessors, people who said they did it, which was a real problem back then, but they hadn't done it. And so if the suspect, if somebody confessed and they knew what the answer was to the key question, they were probably the killer. And the key question had to do with how was the body left. It had something to do with the attitude, the position of the body, which doesn't make sense because the reporters show up minutes after the police are there, and they start, the photographers, the newspaper photographers begin snapping photos of the body. The attitude or position of the body and the way it was left has been, was thoroughly documented. And you can find all those photographs online. How could there be something about the position of the body that wasn't known to reporters and other police officers in the scientific investigation department, or us? I mean, you can look at the photographs and see how the body was left. Anybody could describe that. And photos, even though they were covered up, were also printed in the newspapers. So The one person who I thought might have the answer to that question was Betty Bersinger, the woman who found the body. But I didn't know if she was alive. This is like in 2021, right? So at the time, she's like 101 years old. But I couldn't believe it. I was able to get in touch with Ann Bersinger, her daughter, who was there at the time, but she was only 3 years old and didn't remember it. And she told me that her mother was still alive and living in a care facility in upstate California. And so she put me in contact with her mother, and I had a few questions about the way the body was left. And what Betty Bersinger revealed to me was shocking. And that was that the body was not left by the side of the road, cleanly in two pieces, separated by a gap of 12 inches. It wasn't on full display next to the sidewalk. It actually had been hidden about 14 feet away in the weeds. There were tall weeds that had grown up, because again, it was an abandoned lot. And so the body parts had been tossed into the weeds out of sight. And that's why nobody had seen the body. When Bersinger pushed the stroller down the street, she happened to look to her right at that exact moment and saw this somewhat white form in the weeds. She didn't know what it was. So she stepped inside over the grass and, went forward 6, 8 feet or whatever and saw a torso, but it was on its stomach. She just saw the back. And, there's all this black hair, black Dahlia, black hair, and just the top half, a torso, just the back of it. So she didn't see the horribly tortured face or the horribly tortured body. She just saw a white back, and she thought it was a mannequin because it had been cut in half. So when she goes down the street to call the police, she tells them somebody's left a mannequin out, and it could scare people. When the police show up at 11:09 a.m., that's when they find something very different than a mannequin. And in the book, it goes into detail about why they took it out of the weeds and thus made this famous tableau that has become world famous.
All right, and I really do thank you for that. But right now, would you be open to receiving some challenges or criticisms to the claims that you have put forward?
Absolutely.
Well, you must be familiar with Larry Harnish, the historian of the Black Dahlia case.
Certainly.
And as I understand, you've had some interactions with him, correct?
No, I've never had any communication with him.
Oh, you haven't? Well, I mean, I guess I would say he has made a lot of public criticisms of your book and your theory as well as your observations.
Mhm.
And I'll just share the basic ones with you, and you can respond in any way you want. Let's start number one with the body, because we're talking about that now. The first challenge to your claim with that is that other people have interviewed Betty Bersinger over the years, and it doesn't appear that she told them what she told you about how the body was found approximately 14 feet away in the weeds. Why doesn't everybody who talks to Betty Bersinger come away with the same story?
Well, first of all, let me start by saying that Larry Harnish is critical of anybody that isn't Larry Harnish. He considers himself, I believe, to be the ultimate authority in the Black Dahlia. And so any other writer, anybody else who works on the case, researches the case, or has any ideas that are different from his own, he does everything he can to trash them. So, which I am not a big fan of. I think that we all should be working in the spirit of trying to get to the truth and investigating together to find out what happened to this poor woman. Ultimately, the victim is at the heart of this, and this is the most important thing. And nobody owns this case. Nobody is the ultimate authority. And there's always room for more research. There's always room for speculation and conversation. And I think shutting down other people or trashing them and cherry picking certain facts of the case in order to kind of dismiss others is not helpful to getting to the truth. That having been said, Larry himself, along with a guy named Kyle Wood, interviewed Betty Bersinger many years ago. And if you look carefully at what they asked her and what she said to them, it literally fits in with exactly what she told me. She says that she walked down, she looked to her right, and she saw what she thought was a mannequin. It was so white. And so she went down the street and called the police and told them that there was a mannequin that had been left out. And again, it could scare children. She had seen somebody on their bike earlier in the day, a kid riding around on his bicycle, and they should do something about that and get rid of this mannequin. But the one question that they didn't ask her was, what exactly did the body look like? Where was it left? What was the position? They didn't ask about the details of the body itself. And I asked her that very same question. Why hadn't you told anybody about this before? And her answer was simple. Nobody ever asked. Betty Bersinger was, she was raised in the 1920s. This is in the 1940s. She's 26 years old. I spoke to Ann Bersinger at length about her mother. She just wasn't the kind of woman who wanted the attention or attraction. She didn't seek out a connection to the Black Dahlia case. And she was pretty circumspect over the years. She kind of avoided the glare. But, she was the kind of woman who would answer matter-of-factly with regards to specifically what your question is. And so what they asked was, what did you see? And she told them, I saw a white form and I thought it was a mannequin. They didn't go further, but I wanted to know the exact details of what she saw that morning. Describe for me every memory you have about what happened. And that's when she described what she saw in the weeds. So I think it's a condition of, having been more thorough in considering what was left there. And I also suspect that Harnish did not ask himself the question that is so crucial, which is, why didn't anybody see the body earlier in the day? It doesn't make sense, but it makes total sense when you understand what Bersinger saw and where the body had been left.
And I want to be very clear. I'm not trying to do Larry Harnish any favors because he does not like me either. And I think
I'm
Eli
not sure
explained
who
that.
he likes, but go figure.
Well, I think Eli explained that very clearly. Okay, here's the next challenge, and that is that at the time of the Prairie Heiress murder, 1941, when Leila Welsh was killed,
Mhm.
Carl Balsiger was stationed out of state in the military, and he was actually in
Mhm.
Washington state at the time, so he could not have been the killer. What do you have to say about that?
Right. So in late 1940, in October of 1940, Carl Balsiger is drafted into the military. The Selective Service Act comes in October of 1940. The United States is not yet in World War II. We obviously know that's not going to occur for another 14 months, 15 months, but they were preparing for it. They knew they needed to start recruiting young men into the military. And so he joins the military in late October of 1940. And then he's initially stationed at Leavenworth, Fort Leavenworth, which is about a 40-minute drive north of Kansas City, where the murder of Leila Welsh will occur about 4 months later. He's at Leavenworth for intake for approximately 2 weeks, and then he's sent home for 4 to 5 days, and then he's put on a train. And after a 2-day, 3-day train ride, he alights in Tacoma at McCord Airfield, where he begins his basic training. Now, that training begins around November 10th, 11th, somewhere in there in 1940. Now, back then, basic training, this is before the United States was in World War II, before Pearl Harbor, and the United States officially joined the war, when training was cut down to 8 weeks. Back then, basic training was approximately 12 to 13 weeks. But if you had a very specialized military occupational service, an MOS, which he did, he came from baking royalty. His father was a big baking executive, and he had experience in the baking industry. He was brought into the military to help revamp the field baking operations, which would later become crucial in the Pacific. And the book goes into a little bit of that and what his contributions were to the all-important field baking operations on all those islands. And so Balsiger has a extended training period, basic training period of 16 weeks. And so he's in there for 16 weeks, including a few days off for Christmas. And if you count forward on a calendar from approximately November, 11th, 12th, when he would have begun his service in Tacoma, it literally lines up, in addition to a few days off of Christmas, to early March. And I have his military files. I have over 600 pages of his military files. The morning reports for that particular period do not exist. Morning reports are all the reports that were made of movements of troops or troops being sent home for, rest and relaxation. Right before his 16 weeks is up, he gets promoted to sergeant. They're trying to move him up because they really, they need help with the field baking operations. He would have been sent home on a break immediately after promotion and immediately after basic training was done. The 4 months, those 16 weeks for that specialized field baking operation training he received, exactly lines up with early March. He would have been home at the exact time that Leila Welsh was murdered on the morning of March 9th. And so I believe that actually all of these dates that the military files lay out perfectly lay out with an overlap with the dates he would have been home and would have been capable of committing this murder. And in addition, one of the things the police said, the Kansas City Police Department and Police Chief Lear Reed, was that they believed that the killer had actually left town right after the murder. And indeed, right after the murder, Carl Balsiger returns to Tacoma and continues his service there as a sergeant now. So this is a guy who was literally just promoted before that and goes home and is there during the time that Leila Welsh was murdered.
Okay, and thank you so much for that. I do appreciate that. Now, the final thing that I'll say to you isn't so much a question, but rather a comment, and you can respond any way you want. And that is that I follow lots of unsolved mysteries here on Black Box Online Radio. On Mondays, I talk about the Zodiac Killer. On Tuesdays, about John Benet Ramsey. On Wednesdays, about Jack the Ripper. You're listening to Dahlia Thursday right now. And of course, on Fridays, about D.B. Cooper. And I find that with each mystery, the close followers of that mystery have a different type of behaviors, different types of attitudes. It's almost like its own culture. With the DB Cooper crowd, they're nice. With the Zodiac crowd, they're mean. With the Black Dahlia researchers, there is something that you talked about when you said that people don't work together and it's not about like trying to solve the case as a team. No, I've really found that that comes from everybody. It's so far beyond Larry Harnish. It's almost as if everybody who has followed the case for decades is trying to just discredit everybody else so that they
Yeah.
can be the
Yeah.
loudest, most prominent voice. And when I said beyond Larry Harnish, how about Steve Hodel, who has done that for 25 years? How about John Gilmore, who wrote the book Severed? And when I hear these stories, even from Harnish, when he talks about Will Fowler, about how he said that he viewed the true crime case as his intellectual property. Therefore, he had the right to lie to other people so that he could keep the truth for himself. When I hear these types of things, I'm like, this is going in so many directions. So many close followers of the Black Dahlia case are just trying to make it their own. Or,
Yeah.
let's be
Yeah.
fair, they're trying to be the top guy. And do you have any comments on that and any personal experiences?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great point you make, and it's something that it's one of the aspects of the Black Dahlia world and community that I take umbrage with, and I totally agree with you. It's fascinating, and I agree. Being a kind of student of true crime, it's really interesting that like the Charles Manson community, right? People who research Manson family. They're as interested in Los Angeles in 1969 as they are in Manson. And so much of their research and what they talk about is what the city was like and the locations where the Manson family were. They're a very location-based community. Likewise with, DB Cooper, it's very technical and sort of working together to try to figure out the mystery. Every true crime community, every case community seems to have its own tenor and culture. The thing about the Black Dahlia community is that there are an extraordinary number of really smart and kind of historically educated people who really know their stuff and really have studied the details of the case, and it's very impressive. Nonetheless, there has become this sort of series of camps of people who fall behind suspects that they believe in. There's Leslie Dillon people. There are Hodelites, the people who follow Steve Hodell's theory. There are Harnish fans who believe that Walter Bailey, a senile old man who lived around the corner, somehow murdered this woman and kept her prisoner for 6 days just before he died of old age. There are, people who believe that it was a stranger, a Jack the Ripper type. There's myriad other suspects that these camps kind of fall into. And it's like a blood sport. They go to war with each other and they do everything they can to try to trash each other and trash talk each other. And they're they do sort of the same thing, which is they cherry pick, they select certain facts that promote the evidence of guilt of the suspect they believe in. And they also cherry pick facts to dissuade people from believing in other suspects, right? They try to kind of tear down other theories by cherry picking things that might contradict them without actually looking at the whole array of evidence. Like, for instance, saying that Carl Balsiger was in the military service back then and therefore couldn't have been in Kansas City. Well, people didn't go into the military for 2 years straight. They had breaks there. And if you look at the military files, there's plenty of evidence to show that he was in Kansas City, right? But if you put out there, well, he was in the service, so he couldn't have done it, without going further, it creates this, idea that somehow the evidence contradicts the theory. It's just all of these suspect camps essentially are at war with each other, which again, I just don't think is in the service of getting to the truth. The only thing that should really matter in this case is not our bloodlust or desire to understand what was done to her. What really matters is Elizabeth Short, 22 years old, brutally murdered, her life cut short, a woman of incredible promise, who was beloved by a lot of people. And we owe, if we're going to be interested in this case, if we're going to spend all this time in research, we owe it to try to understand her and what happened to her, which is why it's so important to look at the details. Why would she have been returning to Los Angeles on January 9th? What did she say in her letters about where she was headed to next? What did she feel? What did she want? Who was she? We need to understand those things. And I feel like Elizabeth herself has sort of been excised from most of the research and a lot of these suspect camps. And I think that part of the problem here is that a lot of people want to sort of own her. They want to own the story. They want to be the authority. And ironically, that's something that really haunted her in her life. There were a lot of men who wanted to possess her, who wanted to own her. And she never wanted to be owned. She was actually a really independent young woman and was on the move because she didn't commit to anything. Again, she's only 22 years old, but this was a woman who was on the move. And she would not allow herself to be possessed by any one person. And so I think there's a tendency on the part of researchers today to do what a lot of men in her own life tried to do, which is to own her, to own the story. And I think we owe it to her to be open to every theory, to all the research, to all the evidence, and work in the, to work to get to the truth, work in service of the truth. And that requires being open-minded and considering everything.
Fascinating. Very nicely put, Eli. But right now, I would like to give you the floor and just ask, even though you just made an excellent statement right there, do you have any final concluding messages for the listeners of Black Box Online Radio Anything else you would like to say about your book, Sisters in Death? Any other comments? I'm pretty much going to give you the final word, and it's all yours.
I appreciate that. I'm actually, my final comment will be that I hope folks get a chance to read the book and to consider the evidence. I think it's very compelling, and I think the book represents a significant step forward in determining what really happened. I believe that Carl Balsiger, I think that the evidence against him is overwhelming, but people can make up their mind for themselves. The one thing I would like people to really walk away from, though, from the book or from this podcast or any interaction with the Black Dahlia story, is to remember that unlike what is repeated over and over again, Elizabeth Short was not in Hollywood, was not in Los Angeles to become famous. She had no interest in becoming an actor. She was not seeking roles. She was not seeking out directors and producers. She did not chisel money and free drinks and free meals from men. She went on dates. She also was a loner who was, most of the time she was in Los Angeles, went to the radio shows, the NBC and CBS, at the CBS and NBC radio studios to be entertained. She was a loner. She was independent. She was brave. She set out across the country with very little money to find her own happiness. And ultimately, the motive that she had in life, her entire agenda, was falling in love. She wanted to find somebody that she could care for and somebody who would care for her. Her story is universal. She's like any of us. She was, a 22-year-old woman in search of her own happiness. That's it. Nothing more. We don't need to turn her into the Black Dahlia. We don't need to make her an exotic flower who was, trolling the back alleys of Hollywood, going into seedy clubs and looking for danger. None of that is true. She was all of us. And I think that's the most important thing that people need to walk away from. I'm sorry, walk away with.
Eli Frankel, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ned.
And once again, I would like to thank Eli Frankel for appearing on Black Box Online Radio's Dahlia Thursday. And I really just want to use this as an opportunity to ask you guys, what do you think about Carl Balsiger as a Black Dahlia suspect? What do you think about any of the points that you've heard? And also, this might be the most important one, what do you think about the rebuttals that Eli Frankel placed to the challenges regarding Carl Balsiger? You guys can let me know in the comments section down below. And as always, you can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan, and there's also a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page and BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. And I use these pages to release shorts and reels Monday through Friday, talking about serial killers, true crime news, and anything under the sun or in the darkness. And this show also comes to you Monday through Friday talking about unsolved mysteries. Feel free to start your day with some mystery talk in the morning. On Mondays about the Zodiac Killer, on Wednesdays about Jack the Ripper, on Thursdays about the Black Dahlia, and on Fridays about D.B. Cooper. And for the Tuesday show in the near future, I'm going to be using that as a revolving door of different subjects. There are going to be different cases that will be covered on the Tuesday show from now on. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. This show is available for free downloads anywhere you get your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify, under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. And that's all for me now, and I will see you tomorrow for a new episode about D.B. Cooper. Until next time.